While the frequency and severity of natural disasters globally has more than quadrupled in the last 50 years, Europe has been relatively blessed in this regard. It has experienced fewer major disasters, both because of its geophysical circumstances and because it is better able to cope with extreme environmental events than most regions of the world. Disaster, in this context, is a socially determined concept. A major flood or earthquake in a sparsely inhabited region, for example, is not a catastrophe. And the more robust and resilient a regional economy and society, the more severe event has to be before it can be considered a disaster. By definition, too, extreme environmental events are precisely those that we don't expect to happen in a particular time period, but where the probability of occurrence, combined with the potential for harm, creates sufficient risk that they must be taken into account in planning and policymaking, despite their unlikelihood. They are black swans or security wildcards, impossible to predict reliably and difficult to plan for. Extreme environmental events may be divided into geophysical or tectonic events like volcanic eruptions, earthquakes and resulting tsunamis and landslides, and weather or climatic events such as storms, floods, droughts, heat waves, and unusual cold snaps. And Europe has experienced most of these in the last couple of years. Beyond their general chronic or acute systemic impacts, extreme environmental events can be threat multipliers for more traditional security concerns, including many of those that the other panelists have discussed. Military forces are often the only actors available to cope if a disaster exceeds the ability and resources of local or national emergency services. Disasters abroad can similarly create the need for humanitarian interventions beyond the scope of non-governmental organizations or civilian agencies, or exacerbate the conditions that give rise to the need for military interventions. Major events also have the potential to suddenly and dramatically alter the geopolitical balance in unpredictable ways. Although there is awareness at local, national, and European levels of the threat of extreme environmental events, all too often the low probability of specific events leads to an out-of-sight, out-of-mind mentality, and some threats simply have not been anticipated. The effects of the ash cloud from the Icelandic volcano on the European transport system and economy last April came as a surprise. What national mechanisms and contingency plans were in place proved to be inadequate to the task, and the uncoordinated response and different standards across national borders contributed to the problem. It illustrates the point that the more unlikely an event, the less prepared European governments are likely to be, and for good reason, I should add, given the need to prioritize scarce resources. But it does mean that the risk of these events is actually increased. It also illustrates the fact that while Europe as a whole is, as Bob said, beginning to take coordinated steps to deal with threats such as these, the bulk of the capabilities are still at the national level. Despite the unpredictability and the high uncertainties involved with extreme environmental events, the challenges have always been with us. But there's a new factor in the equation, and that is climate change. The principal impact of climate change in Europe within the next decade or two, which is the scope that we look at in this book, and in particular in my chapter, is an increase in the frequency of many weather events that would now be considered extreme, to the point that they will be considered to fall within the normal range. Unless and until European societies are able to adjust or adapt to a changed, more severe climate, there will be security consequences, and the necessary adaptations will themselves have security implications. Moreover, one of the necessary adaptation mechanisms will be security policy itself. Extreme environmental events, whether in Europe or elsewhere in the world, are perhaps less direct threats to European security than some of the others that we discuss in this book. These events can have an impact on security threats and trends in areas such as energy and critical infrastructure, and their more general systemic effects can contribute to many of the others. But it is the nonlinear nature of the more severe events as potential game changers or wildcards which pose both the greatest threat to security and the greatest challenge to those who must anticipate, mitigate, and avoid their effects. This same trait tends to make these more severe events a lower priority for policymakers than other, more likely ones. This may be justified given the relative probabilities and impacts, but if such threats are downplayed, overlooked, or ignored, the risks may ultimately turn out to be all the greater.